So Greg kind of gave me a sense of what to do today, and what I have is kind of like a very loosely composed series of notes about journal publication, and then he also sent me 2 sample pieces that I could briefly comment on. I think you're familiar with those 2 pieces, right? Is everyone familiar with the protocols of academic publication, or journal publication? Yeah? Okay.
I don't know, if I'd like to reiterate them, that would be,
Yeah, and I think that's pretty much what I wanted to do. So also to recruit those of you who are familiar with those protocols to jump in and maybe fill in some gaps that I might leave. And let me just tell you a little bit about myself. As Greg said, I moved here from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where I was for 12 years. I was on the faculty there in the English department, as well as in Latino studies, gender and women's studies, and this interesting program called the Unit for Criticism and Interpretation, which was an interdisciplinary project that brought faculty from a variety of disciplines in the humanities and the social sciences in particular, but also in the sciences, and people who were working in the sciences but had something to contribute to the humanistic sciences. I'm new here, as Greg said. I have a split appointment with the English department in Media and Cultural Studies. And my areas of interest include film and literature broadly conceived. The first book I wrote was on the discourse of the family and Latino expressive culture, and I looked at the way that the family is used as a trope for not only kinship formations, but also as a way to establish a kind of a national identity. So like you always hear politicians referring to the nation as a family. And so I was interested in the way that the family usually gets trotted out, not only as a kind of symbol for unity, but also a way to kind of normalize the way that we think of community. So I wanted to think about the way that family could be broadly conceived, and so I was thinking about alternative kinship formations, both within a specific Latino context, but also much more broadly based, to think about the way that family has been rearticulated for gay and lesbian communities, for example, as represented in single-headed households, and kind of railing against the way that conservative ideology oftentimes tries to co-opt the idea of the family as being a nuclear kinship formation. So that's what the first book was on. The second, I'm actually working on 2 other books right now. And I won't bore you with those unless you're interested in hearing about them, but well, I'll tell you about them later. So what I wanted to do is just talk about journal publication. And I think the upshot of any kind of conversation about publishing in an academic journal, and I should offer a caveat because what I have to say is pretty much grounded in the humanities, but I do think that this information sometimes cuts across into other fields as well. But the main point is, the main question that's always asked about an article is it an original intervention, and does it build on previous scholarship? I think that's the attendant question. But is the article an original intervention? That has to be asked first and foremost, because an academic journal is not going to want to publish an article that is saying something that has already been said, right? It's a sign that you're intervening in conversations that have been taking place in your respective field, and it also represents a new take on things. So oftentimes, well, I don't say oftentimes, but most of the time, academic journals are seen as representative of the cutting edge scholarship in a field, right? And so whenever you want to know what's hot in a particular field, what people are talking about, you turn to academic journals. In the case of academics, a lot of times books books are the result of journal articles. So it's usually the articles that are published first, and those are the kernels that give rise to books. And sometimes are most of the time book chapters originated as journal articles, and they evolve into book-length studies. So writing an academic article requires a deep familiarity with a theme or a topic. It also means aiming to publish in a suitable journal in which one is contributing to a field's discourse and concerns that presently define that field. Academic journals represent, as I said before, the cutting edge of a field. When one wants to know what is hot in a particular field, one turns to journals representing that field. So how does one publish an article in an academic journal? Of course, you first submit a journal article. And oftentimes, after one submits the journal article, the editor will vet the article, deciding whether it's suitable for that publication and its overall focus. The article will then be sent to two reviewers, oftentimes members of the journal's board, and other times scholars who are identified as experts in that field. So they may or may not be on the editorial board. And those reviewers are responsible for writing reports to assess whether the article should be published in the journal. Oftentimes you'll get one report that is laudatory and it'll say, yes, publish this article. And the second reviewer will say, this is a piece of garbage. And so what happens then is that the editor of the journal will sometimes be the tiebreaker, or they'll send the article out to a third reviewer who will then decide whether or not to move forward with that article as publication. There are usually 4 categories under which a reviewed article will follow: publish without revisions, and this is usually not the case. Publish with revisions, revise and resubmit, which is different than publish with revisions, because sometimes a reviewer will say it's ready to go, they just need to make a few changes here and there. But a revise and resubmit oftentimes is, yeah, there's some interesting ideas here, there's some really amazing kernels of information that could result in result in a publication, but the writer needs to make some serious changes and do some overhaul. And then the fourth category is just simply reject. Right? If the article falls under the second and third categories, it's sent back to the author to make necessary revisions and changes for publication. And in the case of a revise and resubmit, there's no guarantee that the article will be accepted, as it usually must go through a second round of reviews. So if you get a revise and resubmit, make the changes that are suggested by the readers. Send back the article. The journal will sometimes send the piece back to the original reviewers, or they'll send it to a new reviewer or a new set of reviewers, right? Is this all stuff that you already know?
I do, because I've submitted papers for scientific review.
Okay.
And iterations of editing takes a long time, and it even spans years, depending on how intensive the papers are.
Exactly. Yeah, I was gonna build up to that point about. And this is actually the next thing I have here. This can all take months, sometimes years, which then begs the question: is information in journals all that fresh, considering that it takes so long to make its way to publication? I would say that the answer is usually yes, as there is an acceptable time lag in publishing in such a venues. Right? There's usually a backlog of journal articles. Sometimes an issue of a journal won't appear, or it'll appear in 2006, but it'll have the date of 2014, or 2016, but it'll have the date 2014 because there's a delay in publication. All of this to say, though, that publishing in a journal is so significant for academics that it's usually the make or break situation for a lot of faculty to determine whether or not they get tenure. In some cases, it's a book. I know in the humanities, a book is usually what's required for tenure and promotion. But in other fields like sociology or psychology or the sciences, it's a number of articles, which can range anywhere from 5 to 10 articles. I know in sociology, 10 articles is usually the magic number. And I think in the sciences as well. Oftentimes articles are co-authored, and this is largely the case in sciences and social sciences, whereas in the humanities, single-authored articles are looked upon more favorably because it's seen as, you know, the individual scholar did all of the work, and that's a sign of their original scholarship as opposed to a collaborative effort. I think collaboration is really important. It should be embraced in the humanities more than it is. And so that's why I really admire the work of scholars in the social sciences and in the STEM fields that do look favorably upon co-authored pieces. Let's see, what else? So I just have a few notes about the two pieces, the nonfiction submissions 35 and 82 that we all have access to. But let me just stop there and ask if you have any questions, if you want to shift the conversation in any particular way, or if you'd like to just say whatever's on your mind.
I think since we're a little different than academic journals, and we generally, we don't often contact people that have submitted for any kind of revision unless there's something wrong. So obviously the process is slightly more expedited, but it's kind of up to all of us to choose what makes a good submission. Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, so I think maybe what I said can translate into this context where I think what you really should look for is kind of an original intervention, right? That someone is asking a question that hasn't been asked before. And it doesn't necessarily require, as I said before, in the case of, say, an article published in, say, in a more traditional journal, but it doesn't necessarily require a deep familiarity with that field. But I do think what makes an original intervention is something that kind of has a connection to a topic that is significant in the present moment, right? Even in the field of history, for example, I think there's a way in which one can frame an argument that has contemporary relevance and yet is still grounded in an analysis of the past, right? So, for example, right now in the field of literary studies, 19th century American literary studies is really big. But within that field, scholars who are working on queer theory are really pushing that field forward. Now, some people might ask, well, how can you use the term queer, or how can you use a queer theoretical lens to analyze 19th century American literature? Well, you can think about the relationships between men that may or may not be sexual, that are representative in, say, Herman Melville. Or one can think about the different kinds of non-normative identities that might surface in a text by, say, Nathaniel Hawthorne, right? So one can look at Hester Prynne as kind of a queer figure, right? So then thinking about how to breathe new life into a traditional field that then gives it a kind of contemporary relevance. Does that make sense? And I think everyone kind of has a good sense of what might be an original intervention, even if they're not necessarily familiar with that larger field in which one is trying to make a contribution. Does that make sense?
When you were, I know this might be more like I wanted to find out as a writer's standpoint, when you were working on your books, were there moments where you felt like even though you might have a copy that is of great excellence, that it was shot down? That even though it might to your eyes, have been the pinnacle of whatever expression you're trying to say, that it wasn't enough in the eyes of the critique?
Yes, definitely.
And how did you go about like balancing that? Like I'm guessing when we get our submissions and everything, and we have to send back feedback, send feedback. You have to be both constructive at the same time, critical, I think, for the lack of a better word. How did you experience that firsthand, and how would you suggest that we handle it?
Well, reviewing submissions, as you know, is no easy task, right? And oftentimes it requires some, or always requires a kind of critical honesty that is both important for the journal, but also for the writer. And I think, for me, you know, I know a lot of people who might disagree with this, but for me, I've always considered myself someone who is invested in what I'd like to call a critical generosity, whereas that if you see something that's important and worth developing as an article, then you use use the opportunity as a reviewer to provide feedback to the writer to make that an article be the best that it possibly can, right? That means going through each sentence, making sure that you point out moments in the piece that require a significant development, a fleshing out of ideas. Sometimes you might not just believe in an article and think that it might be better suited for another publication, or just it's not up to where it needs to be, and it probably won't reach that point. So then you suggest to the writer that, you know, we're sorry we can't publish this because it doesn't have the ingredients to make it a suitable article for publication. But I think that doesn't mean that you're not a generous reviewer. I think what you have to do is you have to be able to identify valuable moments in the submission and then work with that writer to, in order to flesh it out and to make it into an article that ultimately is something that's publishable and permanent. Yeah. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, it does.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you touched upon the fact that you have to be both considerate of the piece itself and also considerate of the way you deliver the news of that this isn't worthy to publish yet. So I think that's important, and I wanted to see if I could encapsulate that in what we do further on this year when we get submissions and everything to review. I had another question if anyone else didn't have a question. Do you have a question? You guys go
So,
first.
I don't know if you're going to touch on this when you discuss maybe the two pieces that we all kind of look at. But I'm wondering, in some cases when you get like nonfiction or like these kinds of articles about like hot topics, I was wondering if you have any suggestions for how we should go about like maybe fact checking or like seeing like how authentic the author is. Because sometimes I'm worried like we see like these really interesting topics like but then like you're never quite sure because we're all different majors, so it's like we're not all totally immersed in every single field that we receive submissions from. So sometimes it's hard to judge like how should we decide if this piece is like really current or something like that.
Right. And let me just give you a little bit of a little historical anecdote about something that's relevant to that question. Back in the 90s, there was a physicist. I can't remember where he is or was, but he submitted an article to this journal called Social Text, and his name is Alan Sokol. Are you familiar with this?
Yes, I am.
And so he wanted to make a point that a lot of humanities, cultural studies journals were publishing pieces that they had no right publishing because the editors who were vetting these submissions weren't familiar with the fields that they were supposedly working in. And so this guy wrote this article, and it was just a bunch of strung together cliches, and the journal published the article. And then once it appeared in print, he came out and said, you know, I fooled you all. You're just publishing a bunch of bullshit. And this just goes to show that your journal and the field that it represents is a big fraud, because your reviewers have no idea what they're reading. And so, and so the reason why I mention that is because I think oftentimes we're placed in a position where we're reading articles that are representative of a field that we may not have enough familiarity with. And the response to the Sokol piece was that it was compellingly written, even though the editors who read the article didn't know what he was talking about, but the article was nevertheless convincing because of the way that he did present the argument, and did follow certain protocols that are required for all writers of academic journal articles, right? So I think you can never have like a foolproof approach to reading an article, and you can never be completely familiar with the field that the person is writing from. The piece on Nietzsche that we read, you know, I think it's a great intervention. It's making some really important points, and he's quoting a number of scholars like Judith Butler, who is a well-known philosopher who has written on Nietzsche. But if you're not familiar with philosophy, you've never read Nietzsche, you know, it could be a great article and it could read very well, but someone who is an expert in Nietzsche could come out and say, well, this is just flawed because he's not citing X, Y, and Z scholar. So I think all of this to say that it does, you know, point to the way that there are quite a few loopholes with respect to academic journal publication, and unless, you know, and this is, I think, there's something to be said about the interdisciplinarity of a journal that. Of a journal that is trying to cover a wide range of fields, and that the readers may not have a sense of each one of those fields that the journal is trying to represent. Does that make sense? Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to like say, oh, you know, we never really know anything anyway, but there is a difficulty of trying to position oneself as an expert as a reader, but then not having the complete knowledge of a field in order to say whether it's good or not.
Kind of in line of the inquiry about whether or not we can tell whether a work is authentic, I was thinking about a previous submission we had that we know wasn't really scientifically valid. And we liked it though, but we wanted, because kind of a few people jokingly said, I wonder if we could publish this as fiction. Is that the kind of thing that we could send back to someone, hey, we like your work, but we'd rather have it as fiction because we know this is a bunch of, well, hogwash?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that there's a way in which fiction can try to do the work of nonfiction, and it sometimes does, but it doesn't require the same kinds of protocols that would then make it nonfiction.
Thank you.
I mean, I think also too, you know, in a lot of fields like education, for example, autobiography, or as it's called, autoethnography in some circles, is one of the main threads that runs through that scholarship. So positionality, you know, one situates themselves by talking about a personal anecdote or their life history, and that is the critical framework with which the argument is framed, right? You know, it's like, how do you then determine whether or not that's kind of a valid form of scholarly critique, you know, if it's purely anchored in autobiography. Well, I mean, I think there's a way in which you kind of do see the significance of autobiographical narrative, and then think about how it might connect to a more traditional critique that's grounded in, say, certain kinds of citationality where you're referencing other scholars and contributing to a debate. So I think there's an interesting blur between fiction and nonfiction that is certainly present in a lot of current scholarship in the humanities and education, the social sciences. So I think that's also worth considering as well. But just for, you know, I think if a piece is not following those protocols of citationality or referencing other scholars in their respective field, then it becomes difficult to consider as an academic piece that is contributing to, say, philosophy or sociology, you know, whatever the case may be. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
So
That was a good answer.
So I would like to reassure you that the things you have been saying do make sense.
I have a tendency of always asking that question because I don't, you know, I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. Thanks.
My question was on the best example that I can think of is my second capstone that I'm working on, which is potentially going to be on the two different spectrums of work. One is both scientific, and then the other one is both not really rooted in science, but also it's rooted in literature and religious texts, and comparing them to evolutionary discoveries that we have so far made. That was what my paper's going to be on for my second capstone, and I wasn't sure if we come across something of this sort, something that is so unique. Do you think as editors of this board, should we have that capacity to just hand it off to someone else who might have more expertise and just go about that route, or just tackle it ourselves to the best of our knowledge? I think it's similar to your question again about expertise of tackling one's unique subjects and et cetera.
Yeah, I think if there's someone on the board who has a stronger familiarity with the field that piece represents, then they certainly should be the one to read it. Which doesn't mean that someone who isn't in that field can't read it. I mean, especially if it's, you know, as you were saying, a more personal narrative that's less grounded in the sciences, where one is able to kind of ascertain the argument in a way that doesn't require the tools that are part of that field in order to understand. So yeah, I think, I mean, in some cases, I think some pieces are better off being handed to people who do have a stronger familiarity with that field. But then I think in certain cases, it doesn't mean that anyone should be precluded from determining whether or not that's significant enough to publish, because they may have a way to understand the piece based on their respective field. I think this all points to just the question of interdisciplinarity and the ability for people who may be grounded in one field to determine whether something is significant in another field. But I just think that, you know, I'm sure you've heard interdisciplinarity being thrown around during your time here at UCR, but it's usually a buzzword when it comes to administrative discourse, but it's also something that I think that we have to take very seriously, because, you know, what does that mean, and how could it prove important because it does allow us to remove ourselves from the position of expert and one the field that you claim as yours, but you certainly have something to say about a piece because of maybe the certain kinds of interventions that it's making. I heard that you were interested in diabetes and or that you were interested in working in that. Am I wrong, or did I eavesdrop?
Where did you hear that?
Eavesdropping.
I don't know how you hear that. Well, my first capstone's on insulin resistance with non-diabetic patients
Okay.
that have Parkinson's. So that's one of my capstones. The other one is based off of religious text from the Hindu culture and combining with the scientific ideas of evolution and cellular structure, and all these things are. When I was reading such texts, I found such commonality that I had to be that there is a correlation here, rather than just pointing to it as like religion structure is completely it's scientific structure is completely separate. So that's why that was one of my potential papers that I'm going to be working on for the next coming year.
That's great. Maybe as an example of this, I don't want to drag too long about this, but when I was at Illinois, I taught a course called The Poetics of Healing, which was a class that looked at the poetry of William Carlos Williams and Rafael Campo, who's a gay Cuban-American poet. And so the class was about two physicians, Williams and Campo, who also wrote poetry, but thinking about how poetry functioned as a way of healing and an alternative kind of medicine that wasn't grounded, say, in the sciences. And so I had a good number of students in that class who went on to medical school and who are now doctors. So it was really interesting to think about like the overlap between science or medicine and its scientific formations, but then also representations of medicine and the humanities, the humanistic underpinnings of how to talk about healing with respect to two doctors who were also poets. So I think that's maybe ties into what you're talking about and the way that we can think about an interdisciplinary approach to a subject like medicine that does draw from the sciences as well as the humanities. And, yeah, you had your hand.
I did have a question.
Sure.
It was, all right, so we sometimes get these pieces that I feel are very well written. They have their nice citation page with a lot of citations. They're excellent research, but they're dry. They're very dry. In that situation where when our reader is students at universities who are going to pick this up, how do we balance the need to publish something that's, good scholarly work with something that's also entertaining? And how do we tell where the lines are, where it's getting a little too technical, maybe? The piece I'm referring to is a psychology piece, but you get the idea.
As simplistic as this may sound, I think you ultimately have to make the decision whether or not you want to publish a piece that's boring. If you want the journal to be more vibrant and accessible to people who if you want someone to pick up the issue and read that piece that's grounded in psychology and find it interesting and not dry, then you might have to require the writer to do something different with it, so that the material is still there, but the approach has to be rethought, so that it isn't just this boring piece that no one is going to be interested in, aside from people in that respective field. I don't know. I think that's fine, and that's a decision that you can make as an editorial board member. Every journal has an identity, and the editor and the editorial board makes it, I think, collectively make a decision about how they want that identity to be defined. So yeah, and you can just flat out reject it too if it just doesn't do what you want it to do, to give the journal its identity.
Part of why I asked that is right now I'm reading Sartre, the philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reading both some of his drier philosophical discourses, and I'm reading the book Nausea. And well, looking at the two, I know which one I would rather publish in the journal. So I was just kind of thinking, since they both came from the same author, and we don't tend to like send things back to the author, but if we have this feeling that maybe the author could have written a more interesting approach to the exact same subject, should we tell them? Like,
Yeah.
we should do that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I think as a reader, as a reviewer, you have a lot of power to, you know, it might sound kind of mean and nasty, but I think you have every right to make requests of a piece, of a writer of that piece, to make the changes that you see necessary in order to give it a kind of vibrancy, right? And if they don't agree with you, they can go elsewhere and find another venue to publish the piece. Scholars are always put in that position anyway, so, you know, and to kind of tie into what you were saying, there was a piece that I sent to to a journal, and they turned it down, and a few years later I submitted another piece and it was accepted. So it all depends on the piece and whether, you know, it's suitable for that venue, and two, the reviewers that one gets, and whether or not they see it as a suitable piece for the journal. Sure.
If anyone else doesn't have any questions, I'm kind of curious to hear like what your comments are on the two pieces,
Yeah.
because I feel like I really hated one and I was like kind of ambivalent about the other one.
So one of the questions I have for you is, is there a required length for submissions?
There's no required length, but there is a cap on how long it can be.
Okay.
So depending on the genre of what is submitted as well, because there's different page limits for different items. Like research papers and fiction, nonfiction, they're kind of different page lengths.
So let's start with number 35. I thought it was a great engagement with scholars in the field of race studies, but the article needs it needs more of a structure, and I thought this could be addressed by including sections, right? So breaking up the piece so that each section highlights a particular point about the argument that's being threaded through the article. I also thought the thesis needed to be foregrounded. Was the intervention racial stratification, or was it immigration policy? Now, I think the article can address both of those themes, but it seems to me that there's this constant moving back and forth between those two themes, and the author should, in my opinion, either focus on one of them or tell us what, in a much stronger way, what the connections are between these two themes. I think the citations are excellent, but more time needs to be spent unpacking those citations. Oftentimes what happens is that people will cite scholars, and that's not enough, right? It's like, how are you engaging the scholar? How are you contributing to a larger conversation? One should never use a simple quote as a crutch for doing the work of unpacking one's argument and showing how they're engaged with that argument and building upon it, right? Anyone else? Do you agree with that, or?
I totally agree with that. I've worked as a tutor a lot, and the first thing I would do is you need to just go old school and start with an outline.
Yeah.
And then we'll start all over again.
Mhm.
Do a little cut and paste into your outline and get your thoughts organized, because it's all helter-skelter.
Yes.
Yes. That might have actually explained kind of my reaction to it, because to me it just seemed like it was kind of relaying information I was already aware of, and it was just kind of saying the same things that if we are particularly familiar with this topic, or not even particularly familiar with the topic, just kind of in general, it's in public discourse, that we kind of already know all this stuff, and it's not presenting anything new.
Yeah. Exactly. It doesn't tell us what we need to know, or what we should know, and why we should read this article. It's kind of just, saying, like you're saying, things that we're already familiar with. And that's fine, but we need to be convinced as to why we need to know this again, and why this article is presenting this information in this context, and for what reason.
I think I was actually one of the reviewers who looked at this, because I've been here a while. And what we noticed at the time is, like you've been saying, it's like a list of citations. Specifically, I was in the ethnicity class here at this university, and their reading list looks very similar to this list of citations. And because this journal is all about originality, I'm pretty sure that this didn't get published, and I'm pretty sure that it was because it was more like a literature review. So, I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's an important point. I mean, I think literature reviews are important in some cases, but if it's only a literature review, that's not an article. Do you think that there's some redeeming factors? I don't want to say don't publish it, but
I mean, maybe if out of this sort of string of ideas, there can be a point, like you pointed out, that there is a specific tie to immigration and the formation of modern racist infrastructure. However, as of right now, we got like a block of stone, and now someone needs to go in and take a chisel to it.
yeah.
I don't know if that's a good enough tool.
Yeah, more like a jackhammer.
It's true.
Like it's got all the how and why, but none of the to what effect.
Right.
What's the point?
I mean, if they wanted to make this into something more original, and they weren't against doing a little, well, in the field kind of thing, maybe they could go and speak to people and ask them kind of in an ethnography style about, how their own background is related to these topics.
I think that's definitely one approach, including ethnographic data. Another suggestion might be to begin with an anecdote, whether it's personal or something that is happening at the moment, right? I mean, immigration is always a hot topic. So is there something in particular that this writer can bring in at the beginning to anchor the argument in a way that makes us understand what the stakes of this piece are? Does that make sense? So yeah, I think that's one suggestion. And I think having that anecdotal information, or that personal intervention, as we were talking about, is a way to ground the argument in a way that does kind of give it a sense of shape that it doesn't have now. The chiseling effect.
Definitely a lot of shit.
Jackhammer. Yeah.
Jackhammer to get the outline, then chisel for the fine details. Fair.
No, it's.
Multiple ways.
The thing is, I like studying about race. I like reading books about race.
Right.
I could not read all of this. I just skip through because it's just, most of it's stuff that if you have any exposure to race and even the history of race, like, we've covered it. It's pretty well covered. It's
repetitive.
really covered ground.
Yeah.
It's ground that's probably taken a sledgehammer to it a few 100,000 times.
It's actually a paper that I had to write the same paper for a class here.
Yeah,
That
and,
I
and it definitely
immediately
feels
recognized it.
like that
That's
sort of,
okay.
yeah, it's like
Well,
a
that's
class
good
paper
enough.
to like an intro to this sort of topic.
Mhm.
Just don't do it again. It's my new thing that we don't write again.
Yeah.
So the main point that I mentioned at the start of this was, is there an original idea or intervention here? Not yet, I don't think. There could be, but as it presently stands, it's not there.
So let's just say they were to supplement this, right? Like they take, race studies essentially, and they decide to do a modern reflection of it through a study group, or maybe a randomized survey of college students. Would that have that same relevancy now if it were to push beyond these bounds of just reiterating the same ground that has been already covered?
I think it would, do you want to jump in?
Well, I just had a thought that if they were going to resubmit it this year and they were going to change things, maybe they could frame it in terms of the refugee crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or undocumented students on campus. I mean, I think there's kind of some interesting gestures in that direction, but it's never fully developed. So that might be one way to go, yeah. The refugee crisis is another example. But here, the conversation about race is just so broad. And the immigration policy that it's also engaged with, I think, might be, I keep wanting to use the word chiseled now.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. So it really is a matter. I mean, yeah, I think there is some potential here, but the author needs to be directed to a more specific theme in which it doesn't become just a lit review. It's like, what do you have to say about this particular topic that then allows you to frame it within the context of the discourse on race? That has clearly proven beneficial to their thinking, but yeah. For me, the question is always, so what? So what? What does this piece have to say? Do we already know this? Is it just, walking into a bar and talking to someone who's just babbling and you're like, so what? Say something to me, tell me something about yourself. Tell me something about what you're thinking, who you are. I think that's what this piece needs. It needs some kind of relevance to it, yeah.
I think that's the case with a lot of both scientific and non-scientific studies, is that I end up reading like really, really dry papers, and even after much explanation, there seems to be no clear, unique idea that I guess is chiseled out of everything of the construct. All I read whenever I'm reading any scientific body of paper, and the non-scientific aspect of it, is that I'm looking for something that objective, that is different, right? That is unique to all others that I potentially might have read. Do you say that there isn't much left to be covered in such, or is there always areas that has yet to be explored?
I think it's the latter. There are always areas that have yet to be explored. As I always tell people have been writing about Shakespeare for decades, right? And yet people still keep coming up with original things to say about Shakespeare. It's the way that you say it, I think, that kind of makes it interesting and, and I always think that everyone's scholarship is autobiographical, no matter what it is. It could be a science paper, it could be something in the social sciences or in the humanities, and it doesn't always have to be framed by the autobiographical eye, but it's about what your personal investments are, and you can usually tell if someone is invested in their topic based on what's on the page, right? If it's a compelling read, if it's something that's significant, if it's trying to make an intervention. Yeah. The second piece, should we talk about that?
Yeah. Nietzsche?
Yeah. So, what did you all think?
Where were the citations?
Yeah.
I don't know much about philosophy or Nietzsche, but like I just thought this was boring as hell. Like like you're not telling me like it feels like it was really obvious. Like this person probably read a book about Nietzsche and then like was like, oh, there's this one specific aspect that I want to talk about, but they don't tie it back to anything in the real life, in the real world. So
Exactly.
it's like how to read correctly. Well, what's the point of reading correctly, right? Like, what do I get from it?
Yes, excellent. And I think, yeah, same for me. I mean, I completely agree with you. It just feels like a bunch of loosely strung together ideas. Those ideas have great potential, but for me it was just, for being so short, it didn't say what it needed to say in that, the brief amount of pages, right, that we got.
And again, like you had mentioned with the other one, that it doesn't really unpack the quotes. Kind of like, it feels like every sentence is quoting
Exactly.
Nietzsche, and there's no time for them to really discuss the quotes from.
Yes.
For humanities thing, how would you say is the typical ideal golden spot, essentially, of page length or analysis?
Page length, it's usually 25 to 30 pages, double-spaced type pages. And then, the other question?
The ideal analysis that should occur. Yeah.
The ideal analysis, I'm not sure if this actually addresses that, but there should be a coherent thesis, an argument that's present through and through, right?
And that's what I found in this one. When I was reading it, I was like, usually my eyes always look for, like as an English major, I always look for a spot where there is a particular thesis, right? Where it occurs and what it defines for the rest of the thing, and I couldn't find it. It just felt like it was just like that person's self-reflection at this point, rather than an actual scientific analysis or non-scientific analysis. So.
Yeah. And the thing is, it doesn't, I mean, if we were to take it as a fictional piece that engaged with Nietzsche, fine. But I think that the piece betrays itself by citing other scholars who are talking about Nietzsche. So then trying to give the illusion of an engagement with other scholars who are talking about Nietzsche, but not really fulfilling its promise as someone who is contributing to the dialogue.
I just got to realize it feels like a half-baked live journal post.
Yeah.
I kept thinking it was like one of those freshman prompts for your teacher. What are your weaknesses at school? How can you improve on them? That's how I felt it read.
It's kind of like book report.
Yeah.
Because they do have a citation for negate science, but they only have one quote from it, and they also only have one quote from another author, which is not even cited, and almost everything is just from this one book, and that's why it reminds me of book report, because it's like 39, there's all these like quotes from Daybreak, and I think that was Daybreak,
Yeah.
so, like book report.
And there's no excuse for not presenting a compelling argument in so few pages, right? I mean, even when you read a book review in a journal, the job of a book reviewer is to summarize, is to not only summarize the book that they're analyzing, but it's also to present an argument as to why that book should be read or not, right? And so the reviewer always has to make a convincing argument about the book that they're writing about. So I think this short piece, didn't have that argument that even a book review in a journal is required to have, which then makes it come up short, unfortunately, because there are lots of ideas here, but they're not presented in a coherent fashion. I feel like I just raked 2 pieces over the coals.
I mean, they kind of deserve it. Like,
Okay, we're like 3 for 4.
yeah, exactly.
I think we normally reject most nonfiction anyway. Like, I was editor-in-chief last year, and I think every nonfiction piece I put up to have editor's review, everyone was just like, it's not good. It's like, something's wrong with it. Like, either it's just like not coalesced into a good enough idea that we're like, yeah, this idea is like maybe not well written enough, but we like it enough to publish it. Like, it never gets to that point, or it's just like poorly written, or we just like can't even understand like where they're trying to go. So I feel like we kind of have that issue where we're not attracting like that the readership or like that audience of people who really engage with like nonfiction writing a lot, and therefore like really work hard on pieces for like a long time and then have them published. Because I kind of feel like some of these things are just like written over like 2 weeks for a class and then given to us. So
Yeah.
I think that has more to do with the fact that like this is a college journal and that the work that people submit is just stuff that they have done for class.
That's true. And I think the expectation that when they can just turn in a paper that they wrote for class and have it published is misguided, because you always have to revise, right? Like I was saying earlier about the protocols of journal publication, it's very rare that one gets published as is. Revisions of some kind are always required, and so I think it's important that even if someone developed the paper in a class, in order to see it through to publication, they need to keep working on it and develop ideas and flesh them out and make sure that it does look and feel and read like an article and not a paper.
I just have one last quick question, I think. If we get something that someone just ignored our page limit and they send in something long, but we think it's good, how would we know what to tell them to cut? Like, if we couldn't publish the whole thing, like, do you have an idea for what is kind of just filler? Like, how to know when it's filler?
That is the responsibility of the writer. If you have a word limit, you can always say, this is great, we're interested, but it's your responsibility to adhere to the word limit.
So we just kind of throw it back at them.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you have someone who is comfortable with the piece to determine what can be cut, then I think you can say, okay, this section needs to be trimmed down, this can go, the lit review is too long, then fine. But you can always use that word limit as,
All right.
yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions? Well, I guess with that, well, thank you very much for your time.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
I just realized that I didn't go around the table asking people for their names.